Megawatts on your mind from Lighthief. We build it, we run it, we know what works, real projects, real returns. The renewable energy podcast that doesn't waste your time. Let's go.
Hello, and welcome back to Megawatts on Your Mind. This is Lighthief, and today we're discussing something that combines renewable energy with one of the most divisive political topics in recent European history, Brexit, and its impact on the United Kingdom's renewable energy sector. Now, before anyone stops listening because they're tired of Brexit discussions, let me be clear. This isn't a political podcast. We're not debating whether Brexit was a good or bad idea overall. That's been done to death elsewhere. What we're discussing is something much more specific and practical. How did Britain's departure from the European Union actually affect renewable energy development, operation, and investment? What changed? What stayed the same? And where is the UK renewable energy sector heading now that it's charting its own course outside EU frameworks? These are important questions because the United Kingdom has been one of Europe's renewable energy leaders, particularly in offshore wind. The UK has roughly 30 gigawatts of wind capacity installed, about 14 gigawatts offshore, making it the world leader in offshore wind deployment. It has roughly 15 gigawatts of solar. It's pioneered innovative support mechanisms like contracts for difference, and it's set extremely ambitious targets: 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, net zero emissions by 2050. But Brexit created uncertainty. Would investment flee? Would European supply chains become problematic? Would skilled workers from the EU leave? Would regulatory divergence create complications? Would the energy interconnectors with Europe face issues? These weren't theoretical concerns. They were genuine risks that developers, investors, and operators had to consider. Now, several years after the actual Brexit transition, we have data. We can see what actually happened versus what people feared or hoped would happen. And the reality is nuanced. Some impacts were negative, some were surprisingly minimal, and some areas actually benefited from regulatory independence. Today, we'll explore this comprehensively. We'll discuss the UK renewable energy landscape before Brexit, what the concerns were, what actually changed in terms of supply chains, financing, workforce, and regulation. We'll look at specific sectors: offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, and how Brexit affected each differently. We'll discuss the current support mechanisms and policy framework, and we'll explore where the UK is heading, the opportunities, the challenges, and whether Britain can achieve its ambitious renewable energy targets outside the EU. At Lighthief, while we don't have primary operations in the UK, we follow the market closely and work with UK partners. The UK market is important for understanding renewable energy trends because Britain often implements policies and technologies earlier than continental Europe. What happens in UK offshore wind, for instance, often predicts what happens elsewhere 3 to 5 years later. This episode is for developers and investors evaluating UK opportunities, for anyone curious about how Brexit actually affected a major economic sector, for UK-based renewable energy professionals wondering about their industry's future, and for European operators considering whether to expand into post-Brexit Britain. Shall we begin? And perhaps avoid any inflammatory opinions about Brexit itself, because that's not what we're here to discuss. Let's start by understanding where the UK renewable energy sector stood before Brexit, because context matters for understanding what changed. Before the 2016 referendum and the actual 2020 departure, the United Kingdom was firmly established as one of Europe's renewable energy leaders. Not in total installed capacity, Germany had much more solar and wind. But in specific areas, particularly offshore wind, the UK was the undisputed global leader. Offshore wind capacity in 2016 was roughly 5 to 6 gigawatts, already the world's largest offshore wind deployment. The UK had more offshore wind than the rest of the world combined. This leadership resulted from excellent resources. The shallow waters of the North Sea, Irish Sea, and around British coasts are ideal for offshore wind. It also resulted from supportive policy, the renewables obligation, and subsequently the contracts for difference mechanism provided bankable long-term revenue certainty. Onshore wind had about 9 gigawatts installed by 2016. Deployment had been strong through the early 2000s, but slowed after 2015 when government support was reduced and planning restrictions tightened. Scotland had the majority of UK onshore wind capacity, with some in Wales, northern England, and limited deployment in southern England, where local opposition was stronger. Solar had grown dramatically from nearly nothing in 2010 to around 11 gigawatts by 2016. This rapid deployment was driven by generous feed-in tariffs and renewables obligation support. Like Germany's boom years, the UK experienced intense solar deployment when economics were favorable, followed by policy corrections when support costs escalated. The support mechanism framework was the renewables obligation for older installations and increasingly contracts for difference for newer projects. Is an auction-based mechanism where developers bid to deliver renewable capacity at specific prices, receiving the difference between the strike price and market price. This provides revenue certainty while allowing market price exposure. The mechanism was innovative and subsequently adopted or adapted by other countries. The supply chain was substantially European and international. Turbines came from manufacturers like Siemens Gamesa, Vestas, GE, some with UK manufacturing facilities, but most components sourced internationally. Solar modules came primarily from China, as everywhere. Balance of system components, cables, substations, all sourced from European and international suppliers. The UK had domestic capabilities in some areas like offshore installation vessels and subsea cables, but relied heavily on European supply chains. The workforce was partly international. Construction projects employed workers from across Europe, Polish electricians, Portuguese welders, Romanian laborers. Not the majority, but substantial numbers. European engineers and technicians worked on UK projects. This was facilitated by EU freedom of movement, allowing easy recruitment and deployment of skilled workers. Financing was substantially international. European banks and institutional investors provided project finance. The UK renewable energy sector attracted capital from across Europe and beyond, benefiting from EU membership's perceived stability and access to European capital markets. The regulatory framework was aligned with EU directives, energy policy, environmental regulations, grid codes, all influenced by or aligned with EU frameworks. This created consistency across European markets, reducing friction for companies operating in multiple countries. Grid interconnectors with Europe were operational and expanding. The UK had undersea cables connecting to France, Netherlands, Ireland, with more planned. These interconnectors allowed electricity trading, helping balance the UK grid and providing revenue opportunities. The integrated European energy market meant British renewable generation could serve European demand, and vice versa. The renewable energy industry sentiment was generally positive about EU membership. The integrated market, access to European supply chains and workforce, capital availability, and regulatory consistency were viewed as beneficial. There was concern that Brexit could disrupt these advantages. The specific concerns articulated before and immediately after the referendum were substantial. Would European companies reduce UK investment? Would supply chain complications increase costs and timelines? Would skilled European workers leave, creating workforce shortages? Would financing become more expensive or difficult? Would regulatory divergence create complications? Would interconnectors face political or technical complications? These weren't unreasonable concerns. Brexit created genuine uncertainty in a sector that values predictability. Renewable energy projects are long-term investments, 25-year horizons, making political and economic stability crucial. Brexit was a leap into the unknown. The UK government's response was to emphasize continuity and commitment. They reiterated renewable energy targets, committed to ongoing CFD auctions, invested in offshore wind port infrastructure, and attempted to reassure the sector that Brexit wouldn't derail the energy transition. But words needed to be backed by action, and until the actual Brexit transition occurred and its effects became visible, uncertainty remained. Developers made decisions about UK investments versus focusing on continental European opportunities. Investors reconsidered risk premiums for UK projects. Operators wondered about long-term implications for their UK assets. The pre-Brexit UK renewable energy sector was strong, growing, and internationally integrated. Brexit threatened to disrupt that integration. What actually happened is our next topic. Right, let's discuss what actually happened to UK renewable energy as a result of Brexit. Now that several years have passed since the 2020 transition, we can assess real impacts versus speculative fears. Starting with investment flows, did capital flee Britain? The short answer is no, but it's nuanced. Major project announcements continued. The offshore wind pipeline actually accelerated post-Brexit. International developers like Ørsted, SSE, RWE, Vattenfall, Equinor continued investing billions in UK offshore wind projects. This suggests that investor confidence, while shaken temporarily, remained fundamentally sound. However, there were effects. Some European institutional investors reported increasing their risk premiums for UK investments slightly. The cost of capital for UK renewable projects probably increased modestly relative to comparable European projects, perhaps 20 to 30 basis points, not catastrophic, but real. For billion-pound projects, this translates to meaningful additional financing costs. Some developers that were considering UK market entry decided to focus on continental Europe instead, viewing Brexit uncertainty as unnecessary complication. This reduced competition somewhat, which actually benefited developers already committed to the UK market. Supply chain impacts were more tangible. The immediate concern was customs and border delays. Post-Brexit, moving goods between UK and EU required customs declarations, checks, and paperwork that weren't necessary before for renewable energy equipment, massive turbine components, lengthy cables, containers of modules. This created logistics complications. Initially, there were delays. Shipments sat at ports awaiting customs clearance. Paperwork errors caused rejections and reprocessing. Costs increased from administrative overhead and delay penalties. The industry adapted through improved logistics planning, customs brokers, and pre-positioned inventory. But the friction was real. Some manufacturers reconsidered UK manufacturing. Siemens Gamesa, which had blade manufacturing in Hull, evaluated whether to expand, maintain, or reduce UK production. Given the complications of importing materials and exporting products, GE had similar considerations for offshore wind facilities. The calculus changed when UK was outside the EU customs union. However, the UK government implemented policies to encourage domestic manufacturing. Contracts for difference auctions included UK content requirements or scoring criteria favoring domestic supply chain, port infrastructure investments, supported offshore wind logistics. These measures partially offset Brexit's negative supply chain effects. The net result: supply chains adapted. Costs increased modestly, perhaps 2 to 5% for projects due to logistics complications. Timelines extended slightly. But catastrophic supply chain breakdown didn't occur. The industry proved resilient and adaptive. Workforce impacts were concerning initially. Freedom of movement ended, requiring European workers to obtain visas for UK employment. Many European workers in UK renewable energy sector had to apply for settled status. To remain, new recruitment from Europe required sponsorship and work permits, adding complexity and cost. Some European workers left the UK, particularly lower-skilled construction workers. The pool of available skilled workers contracted somewhat. Wages increased slightly due to reduced labor supply. Projects faced recruitment challenges more frequently than pre-Brexit. But again, adaptation occurred. UK renewable energy companies increased domestic training programs. Apprenticeships and technical education partnerships expanded. Some workers who might have left were incentivized to stay through wage increases. And the visa system, while more complicated than freedom of movement, functioned adequately for recruiting critical skills. The workforce impact was noticeable but manageable. It emphasized the importance of domestic skills development, which arguably benefits long-term, even if it's less flexible than unrestricted access to European labor pool. Regulatory divergence was feared, but has been limited so far. The UK retained most EU energy regulations initially through the EU Withdrawal Act mechanism. Subsequent divergence has been selective. Some regulations were streamlined or adapted to UK-specific circumstances, but wholesale divergence hasn't occurred. This regulatory continuity was pragmatic. Renewable energy regulations that work adequately don't need changing just for the sake of divergence. Equipment standards, grid codes, environmental assessments, most remained aligned with European practice because there's no reason to differ dramatically. However, regulatory independence provides flexibility. The UK can now implement policies without EU approval or consensus. This enabled faster decision-making on certain issues like offshore wind targets and support mechanisms. Whether this flexibility proves valuable, long-term remains to be seen. Energy trading and interconnectors faced complications initially. The UK left the EU internal energy market, requiring new trading arrangements. The interconnector arrangements needed revision. There were concerns that trading would become less efficient and interconnector capacity underutilized. In practice, trading continued with adapted mechanisms. New arrangements were negotiated. Interconnector utilization remained high. The economic benefits of electricity trading are too substantial for political disagreements to permanently block the system works, though with more administrative complexity than pre-Brexit. New interconnector projects continued. The Viking link to Denmark, additional capacity to France and Netherlands, all proceeded post-Brexit. This demonstrates that infrastructure investment continues despite political separation. The pound's depreciation post-Brexit referendum had mixed effects. For UK-based generators selling into domestic market, it was largely neutral. For projects financed in euros or dollars, the weaker pound increased costs. Equipment, international contractors, euro-denominated debt all became more expensive in pound terms. This was a genuine negative impact, though currency fluctuations affect all internationally financed projects regardless of Brexit. Green finance and ESG investment actually increased in the UK post-Brexit. International focus on climate change intensified. The UK's net zero commitments and offshore wind leadership attracted ESG-focused capital. Brexit didn't prevent UK renewable projects from accessing green finance markets. Research and innovation partnerships faced some disruption. UK participation in EU research programs like Horizon required new arrangements. Some collaboration became more complicated, but UK research institutions remained active in international renewable energy research, and domestic programs like the Offshore Wind Innovation Hub expanded. The practical assessment. Brexit created friction, increased costs modestly, required adaptations, and introduced uncertainty. But it didn't derail UK renewable energy development. The sector proved resilient. Key factors enabling this resilience were strong domestic policy support, excellent renewable resources, particularly for offshore wind, continued international investor interest, and industry adaptation. The worst-case scenarios feared by Brexit opponents didn't materialize, but neither were Brexit benefits for renewable energy sector particularly evident. It was mostly neutral with modest negative effects, basically unhelpful complication that the industry navigated successfully. Let's focus specifically on offshore wind, because this is where the UK has been most successful and where Brexit impacts are most instructive. The UK's offshore wind sector has grown dramatically since 2016, Brexit notwithstanding. From roughly 6 gigawatts in 2016 to over 14 gigawatts in 2024. This growth continued through the Brexit referendum, negotiation, transition, and post-Brexit period. It's clear that offshore wind wasn't derailed by Brexit. Why did offshore wind continue thriving despite Brexit uncertainty? Several reasons. First, the fundamental drivers were unchanged. The UK has world-class offshore wind resources. The North Sea, Irish Sea, and Atlantic approaches have excellent wind speeds, relatively shallow water amenable to fixed-bottom turbines, and extensive sea areas with limited competing uses. These geographical advantages don't care about political arrangements. Second, government commitment remained strong. The Conservative governments post-referendum, despite their Euroscepticism, were strongly supportive of offshore wind. This wasn't just rhetoric. They backed it with policy and money. The offshore wind sector deal in 2019 committed to 30 gigawatts by 2030. This was later increased to 50 gigawatts. These targets provided confidence that enabled continued investment. Third, the Contracts for Difference mechanism provided bankable revenue certainty. CFD auctions continued regularly post-Brexit. Strike prices declined steadily as costs fell and competition increased, but developers could still achieve acceptable returns. The auction results were sometimes controversial. The 2023 round failed to attract offshore wind bids because strike prices were set too low given inflation and supply chain costs. But the mechanism fundamentally works. Fourth, the UK supply chain and infrastructure for offshore wind became increasingly sophisticated. Ports like Able Marine Energy Park on the Humber, developments in Teesside, expansions in Scotland, all created infrastructure, specifically for offshore wind construction and maintenance. This domestic capability reduced dependence on European supply chains. Fifth, the major developers were already committed and invested. Companies like Ørsted, SSE, Scottish Power, Equinor, all had substantial existing UK offshore wind portfolios and ongoing projects. Abandoning the UK market would have meant walking away from billions in assets and contracted projects. They had strong incentives to make Brexit work rather than retreat. The technology continued advancing. Turbine sizes increased dramatically, from 6 to 8 megawatts in the early 2000s to 13 to 15 megawatts now, with even larger turbines in development. Larger turbines reduce installation costs per megawatt and improve economics. This cost reduction trajectory continued regardless of Brexit. Floating offshore wind is emerging with the UK again leading. The deep waters off Scotland are ideal for floating wind. Projects like Hywind Scotland and Kincardine demonstrated commercial viability. The UK government allocated specific CFD capacity for floating offshore wind, supporting technology development. This innovation leadership persists post-Brexit. From an O&M perspective, offshore wind presents both continuity and Brexit-related adjustments. The fundamental O&M requirements didn't change. Turbines need maintenance regardless of political arrangements. Crew transfer vessels, jack-up vessels, technicians with offshore training, all still necessary. However, some complications arose. European O&M providers needed to navigate visa requirements for technicians. Equipment and spare parts from European suppliers faced customs procedures. Coordination with European vessel operators became slightly more complex. But the UK offshore wind O&M sector adapted. Domestic O&M capacity expanded. More UK-based crew transfer vessels entered service. Training programs for offshore wind technicians increased. The sector developed stronger domestic capabilities, partly necessitated by Brexit. The economic case for offshore wind improved significantly. Post-Brexit, though not because of Brexit, the driver was technology cost reductions and increasing electricity prices. The wholesale electricity price increases in 2021 to 2022 made offshore wind economics extremely attractive. Even merchant projects without CFD support became viable. Some offshore wind projects experienced delays due to supply chain issues exacerbated by Brexit and COVID-19. But determining how much delay resulted specifically from Brexit versus other factors like pandemic disruptions or general supply chain constraints is difficult. Projects were delayed, but Brexit was one of multiple contributing factors, probably not the dominant one. Looking at announced projects in pipeline, UK offshore wind looks extraordinarily healthy. Dogger Bank, 3.6 gigawatts when complete, will be the world's largest offshore wind farm East Anglia projects. Moray Firth developments, Celtic Sea opportunities, Irish Sea expansions. The pipeline extends to gigawatts of capacity through the 2020s and into the 2030s. International investment in UK offshore wind remained strong. European developers like Ørsted, Vattenfall, and RWE continue as major players. The UAE's sovereign wealth funds invested in UK offshore wind. Japanese trading houses acquired stakes. This international interest demonstrates that UK offshore wind is viewed as attractive investment despite Brexit. The practical assessment, UK offshore wind is a success story that continued through Brexit. The sector adapted to Brexit complications, continued growing, and maintained international investment and developer interest. The UK remains the global leader in offshore wind deployment and innovation. Whether Brexit helped, hindered, or was neutral for offshore wind is debatable. It certainly didn't help. The complications were real, but it didn't prevent success. Either strong fundamentals, resources, policy support, technology progress, established industry outweighed Brexit friction. Let's discuss onshore wind and solar, where the Brexit impacts and overall market dynamics are different from offshore wind's success story. Starting with onshore wind. The UK has roughly 13 to 14 gigawatts of onshore wind installed as of 2024. This has grown only modestly since 2016, not because of Brexit, but because of domestic policy decisions that preceded Brexit and continued afterward. The issue with UK onshore wind is planning, not Brexit. In 2015, the Conservative government implemented changes that effectively gave individual households veto power over nearby wind developments through planning rules. This, combined with reduced financial support, caused onshore wind deployment to collapse from over 1 gigawatt annually before 2015 to nearly zero for several years. Scotland, which has devolved planning authority, maintained more supportive policies and continued modest onshore wind deployment. Wales and Northern Ireland had some projects. But England, which has the majority of UK population and electricity demand, essentially banned new onshore wind through planning restrictions. Brexit had minimal direct impact on this situation because the problem was domestic planning policy, not EU-related issues. However, Brexit arguably contributed indirectly. The political bandwidth consumed by Brexit negotiations and implementation meant less focus on energy policy. The planning restrictions on onshore wind weren't revisited because government attention was elsewhere. Recently, there's been modest policy relaxation. The UK government acknowledged that onshore wind is the cheapest form of new electricity generation, and that planning restrictions were counterproductive for net zero goals. Some easing of restrictions occurred, but onshore wind remains constrained compared to offshore or solar. From an O&M perspective for UK onshore wind, Brexit impacts were minor. The existing installed base requires maintenance regardless of Brexit European technicians faced visa requirements, but onshore wind O&M workforce is substantially domestic anyway. Equipment supply chains faced modest Brexit complications, but nothing catastrophic. The real challenge for UK onshore wind O&M is the aging installed base. Much of UK's onshore wind was installed 2010 to 2015 and is now approaching midlife gearbox replacements, blade refurbishments, generator overhauls, all becoming more common. The O&M intensity and cost increase as turbines age. Repowering is an opportunity. Many UK onshore wind farms were built with smaller turbines, 2 to 3 megawatts. Modern turbines are 4 to 6 megawatts or larger. Repowering allows dramatically increased capacity on existing, already permitted sites. Several UK onshore wind farms have undertaken or are planning repowering. Brexit hasn't particularly affected this. It's driven by economics and existing planning consents. Now, solar. The UK has roughly 15 gigawatts of solar installed, up from 11 gigawatts in 2016. Growth has been steady but unspectacular. The rapid deployment of the early 2000s ended when feed-in tariffs became less generous. Subsequent deployment has been moderate. Brexit's impact on UK solar has been limited. Solar modules are imported globally, predominantly from China. Whether the UK is in or out of the EU doesn't dramatically affect Chinese module supply. Some European balance of system components faced customs complications, but alternative suppliers exist globally. The workforce for solar installation is substantially UK-based. European workers were involved, particularly in large utility-scale projects, and visa requirements created some complications. But the impact was less than for offshore wind, where specialized skills are scarcer. Solar project finance post-Brexit continued adequately. Subsidy-free solar projects, merchant or corporate PPA-based, have been deployed. The economics are marginal in UK's climate, but projects proceed where land is cheap, grid connection is available, and offtake is secured. From an O&M perspective, UK solar faces the same challenges as solar elsewhere, plus some UK-specific issues. The aging installed base requires increasing maintenance, performance degradation from accumulated soiling, module degradation, inverter aging, all normal solar farm aging issues. UK-specific challenges include weather. Relatively frequent rain means less soiling, but also less production. Winter production is extremely low, creating revenue concentration in summer months. Vegetation management is intensive in UK's damp climate, where plants grow enthusiastically. Brexit affected UK solar O and M minimally. The work is substantially domestic anyway. European-made inverters or monitoring systems faced modest complications, but nothing preventing normal operations. The future for UK onshore wind depends on planning reform, not Brexit. If planning restrictions ease significantly, deployment could accelerate. If not, growth remains minimal. Brexit is largely irrelevant to this dynamic. The future for UK solar depends on cost competitiveness and land availability. As costs decline, and especially if solar plus storage economics improve, deployment should increase large-scale solar farms in southern England, where solar resources are increasingly viable. Again, Brexit is largely tangential. The practical assessment for onshore wind and solar, Brexit had limited impact. The real drivers of deployment were domestic policy choices, economics, and in onshore wind's case, planning restrictions. These sectors didn't benefit from Brexit, but they weren't particularly harmed either beyond modest supply chain friction. Right. Let's discuss where UK renewable energy is heading post-Brexit and whether Britain can achieve its ambitious targets outside the EU framework. The headline target is net zero emissions by 2050, legislated in 2019. This requires massive expansion of renewable electricity generation, electrification of heating and transport, efficiency improvements, and probably some carbon capture and storage. Renewable energy is central to this transition. Specific renewable targets are aggressive: 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, up from current 14 gigawatts. This requires adding roughly 5 to 6 gigawatts annually for the rest of the decade. That's achievable. The industry has capacity. The pipeline exists. The planning frameworks are in place. But it's not guaranteed, particularly if CFD auction strike prices remain uneconomical or supply chain constraints tighten. 70 gigawatts of total wind by 2030 is the broader target, implying substantial onshore wind growth. This seems ambitious, given planning constraints. Unless onshore wind planning is reformed significantly, reaching 70 gigawatts total wind seems unlikely. More realistic might be 60 gigawatts, 50 offshore, 10 to 12 onshore. Solar targets are less specific, but implicit modeling for net zero suggests 40 to 50 gigawatts of solar by 2030, up from current 15 gigawatts. This requires doubling or tripling deployment rates. It's achievable technically. Solar is cheap and relatively quick to build. But it requires addressing grid connection delays, securing sufficient sites, and ensuring financial support mechanisms or merchant economics work. Energy storage targets are emerging. The UK recognizes that high renewable penetration requires storage. Targets aren't yet as firm as for generation, but the direction is clear. Gigawatt hours of battery storage will be needed by 2030. The market is developing rapidly with numerous battery storage projects in pipeline. The policy framework post-Brexit provides both opportunities and challenges. Opportunities include regulatory flexibility. The UK can set policies without EU consensus. This enabled ambitious offshore wind targets and faster decision-making. The UK can potentially lead in areas like floating wind or tidal energy without waiting for EU frameworks. Challenges include isolation from European markets and programs. The UK can't access EU renewable energy funding programs. Cooperation on cross-border renewable projects or interconnectors requires bilateral negotiations rather than EU-level frameworks. This adds complexity. The contracts for difference mechanism continues as the primary support system. CFD auctions are scheduled regularly, providing predictability for developers. The mechanism needs periodic adjustment. The 2023 auction failure showed that strike prices must reflect actual costs, but it's fundamentally sound. Grid investment is critical and somewhat behind schedule. The UK grid needs massive reinforcement to handle increased renewable capacity, particularly offshore wind. National Grid has plans for substantial upgrades, but planning and construction take years. Grid constraints could limit how fast renewable deployment actually occurs, regardless of generation capacity awards. Supply chain development is a priority. The UK government emphasizes domestic content in offshore wind and other renewables. Port infrastructure investments, manufacturing incentives, training programs, all aimed at building UK supply chain capacity. This reduces European supply chain dependence, which is arguably a Brexit benefit, forced to develop domestic capabilities rather than relying on European supply. Skills and workforce development are recognized challenges. The renewable energy sector needs tens of thousands of additional workers over the next decade, apprenticeship programs, university courses, on-the-job training, all expanding. The loss of easy European labor access makes domestic skills development more critical. Innovation and technology leadership remain UK strengths. Offshore wind innovation, floating wind development, tidal energy research. The UK continues as a leader in renewable energy technology post-Brexit. There's emphasis on maintaining this leadership through domestic innovation funding and international collaboration outside EU frameworks. International partnerships are evolving. The UK is developing renewable energy partnerships with countries beyond Europe. North Sea wind collaboration with Norway, Denmark, Netherlands continues despite Brexit. The UK is exploring partnerships with US, Middle East, Asia on renewable technologies and investment. Brexit hasn't isolated the UK internationally, just changed the partnership frameworks. Investment outlook is generally positive despite Brexit. The UK remains attractive for renewable energy investment due to excellent resources, stable policy frameworks, mature markets, and ambitious targets. The cost of capital is slightly higher than pre-Brexit and slightly higher than comparable EU countries, but the difference is modest and not preventing investment. The practical challenges to achieving targets are less about Brexit and more about grid capacity and connection delays, major constraint on deployment speed, planning permissions, particularly for onshore wind and transmission infrastructure, supply chain capacity. Can the global supply chain deliver equipment fast enough? Workforce availability. Enough skilled workers to build and maintain capacity? Financing at scale, mobilizing hundreds of billions of investment. These challenges exist regardless of Brexit. Brexit adds modest additional friction, but isn't the binding constraint on any of them. The comparison with EU countries is instructive. Some EU countries are deploying renewables faster than UK, Spain's solar boom, Poland's solar growth. Others are slower. France and Italy face planning and grid challenges similar to UK. Germany's offshore wind deployment is strong, but onshore wind struggles with permitting like UK. The UK isn't obviously falling behind EU counterparts post-Brexit. It's progressing similarly to comparable large European countries. Brexit hasn't created a dramatic competitive disadvantage, nor has it provided a significant advantage. It's largely neutral in the overall trajectory. Looking to 2030 and beyond, the UK renewable energy future looks reasonably positive. Offshore wind will continue growing strongly. Solar should expand substantially. Onshore wind growth is uncertain depending on planning reform. Storage will grow rapidly. The net zero trajectory is challenging, but achievable, if policies remain supportive and implementation is effective. Brexit's long-term impact on UK renewables will probably be modest. It created complications and costs. It reduced some flexibilities. But it didn't fundamentally change the drivers of renewable energy deployment, resource quality, technology costs, policy support, climate imperatives. These factors matter more than EU membership status. So, we've explored Brexit's impact on UK renewable energy comprehensively. The pre-Brexit landscape. What actually changed? How different sectors were affected? And where the UK is heading. Key takeaways. Brexit created uncertainty and complications for UK renewable energy. Supply chains faced friction, workforce access reduced, costs increased modestly. Regulatory frameworks required adjustment, but the sector proved resilient and adaptive. Offshore wind, the UK's crown jewel, continued thriving. Growth accelerated through Brexit transition. International investment remained strong. The UK maintained global leadership. Brexit was an annoyance, not a disaster. Onshore wind and solar were affected minimally by Brexit because their challenges were primarily domestic. Planning restrictions, modest economic returns in UK climate Brexit was largely irrelevant to these sectors' struggles and opportunities. The policy framework post-Brexit provides both challenges and opportunities. Regulatory independence allows faster decision-making and UK-specific policies. But isolation from EU programs and markets creates complications. The net effect is probably slightly negative, but not dramatically so. The future outlook is positive. The UK has ambitious but achievable renewable energy targets. Offshore wind will continue expanding. Solar should grow substantially. Storage will develop rapidly. The net zero pathway requires massive renewable deployment, and the mechanisms exist to achieve it. Brexit's ultimate impact on UK renewables is probably best described as unhelpful friction that was successfully navigated. It made things more complicated and expensive at the margins. It introduced uncertainties that consumed management attention. It created barriers that required adaptation and workarounds. But it didn't derail the renewable energy transition or cause catastrophic problems. For international investors and developers, UK remains attractive despite Brexit. Excellent resources, stable policy frameworks, ambitious targets, mature markets. The fundamental attractions persist. The additional complications from Brexit are manageable for professional organizations. For UK-based renewable energy professionals, Brexit is now historical fact rather than ongoing uncertainty. The new frameworks are established. The adaptations have occurred. The focus shifts from how do we handle Brexit to how do we achieve net zero. The broader lesson is about resilience. Renewable energy industries can successfully navigate major political and economic disruptions. The fundamentals, resource quality, technology economics, climate imperatives are powerful enough to override political complications. In future episodes, we'll continue exploring renewable energy across different technologies, markets, and challenges. We'll share more practical insights from actual operations and continue providing honest assessment rather than political or promotional narratives. This is Lighthief, reminding you that while politics creates headlines, physics and economics ultimately drive renewable energy deployment. Brexit changed the political context for UK renewables, but it didn't change the wind resource in the North Sea or the declining cost of solar modules. Those fundamentals matter more than Brussels versus Westminster. Until next time, may your offshore wind farms produce consistently, your planning permissions be approved, and your post-Brexit supply chains function adequately, because adequate is often sufficient when the fundamentals are strong.